I'm very happy to open the afternoon session. We are going to have 3 lectures. I'm sure they will wake you up after lunch. It's a very difficult time for all of us, but I promise you. Okay, and our first speaker, Professor Katrin Kogman-Appel, is the Deputy Dean of Humanities and Social Studies at the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, where she also holds the Metz Memorial Chair at the Department of Arts. She is the author of numerous publications in the field of Hebrew illuminated manuscripts. Among her books are Jewish Book Art Between Islam and Christianity, published by Brill in 2004, Illuminated Agadot for Medieval Spain, Penn State University Press, 2007, A Machzor from Worms, Art and Religion in a Medieval Jewish Community, a monograph on the Leipzig Machzor, Harvard University Press, 2012. She is currently working on a study on Elisha Kreskes ben Avraham, a 14th century Jewish scribe, illuminator, and a map maker in Majorca. Today she is returning to Ashkenaz. Her title is The Role of Hebrew Initials in Making the Divine Visible. Please.
זה כבר בסדר, זה שלי כבר.
לא, בסדר. אני צריכה להדליק את ה... זה העכבר.
יש לי את זה, כן, תודה. תודה רבה. טוב, הנה. Thank you very much, Sarit, and good afternoon to you all. Okay, this seems to work. So this is some sort of tiny little footnote that actually grew out of some additional thoughts after I finished the book on the Leipzig Machzor. So the Leipzig Machzor is coming back, but this is actually not included in the book. So in Ashkenazi Machzorim, the Shavuot liturgy begins with the piyut Adon Imnani, the Lord has nourished me. The hymn sung, so to speak, by the Torah, the law itself, poetically delineates the role played by the law among the people of Israel. The most common iconography for this poem and the entire Shavuot liturgy is a narrative representation of the transmission of the tablets, as shown in the tripartite Machzor, for example, written and illuminated in the area of Lake Constance in the Upper Rhine region around 1320. The piyut, Adon Imnani, is also illustrated in the so-called Loud Machzor, now in the Bar-Ilan library, a book also written and illuminated in the south of Germany, perhaps in Franconia, around the middle of the 13th century. Here, however, the imagery is slightly different. The Sinai event seems to be somewhat marginalized, squeezed into the uppermost part here of a full-page composition, whereas the main focus of the imagery appears within a large arch, circumscribing the opening word Adon, the Lord. The initial is set between 2 horizontal beams that are an integral part of the architectural structure of the arch. As I've shown elsewhere, beneath the arch, we see what I interpreted as the initiation of the sacrificial cult, described in Exodus, and the temple as the later locale of this cult housing the law. So that would be this scene underneath the arch. But that's not the subject of my talk today. That is published elsewhere. The appearance of the initial Adon between 2 horizontal beams, which are integral parts of the architectural structure, seems to emphasize the notion of the temple as God's dwelling place. Of course, a pictorial representation of God as a figure was and is unthinkable of in Jewish art. And here you just have the famous symbol of the temple that runs through the history of Jewish art from the Par Kochba coins in the 2nd century up to the Middle Ages. And this symbol somehow grow out of an abstraction of the Ark. The Ark of Covenant with the Kaporet or the cherubim above it, and it's really one of the common themes of Jewish art. And I suggest that this Ark with the sacrificial scene underneath alludes to that very symbol. Oops. The appearance of the initial Adon between the two horizontal beams, and I said that already, alludes to the temple as God's dwelling place. In another slightly later Machzor, produced in Worms in the Middle Rhine region, but now held by the University Library at Leipzig, we find another example of the use of letters or words as representation of the divine. The opening page for the liturgy of the morning service of Shabbat Shkalim here shows the text of the first piyut to be recited during that service, entitled El Mitnaseh, God the Mighty One. The poem refers repeatedly to the extra Shkalim pericope, which tells about the Israelites giving half a shekel each for the tabernacle as expiation to avert plague, quote unquote, to avert plague breaking out among them. The poem suggests a close connection between that payment and the atonement for sins, but in its first part, it focuses on the glory of God and ends with an allusion to the divine throne of glory as it is described in the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel. Quote, Israel raises her head and she's elevated at the sight of the throne. So that is part of the piyut on this very page. The balance scale in the center of the composition here refers to the narrative of payment, the balancing of the weighing of the shekels, but functions also, or even more so, as a symbol for the atonement of sin. Balanced and level, they are attached to the upper frame of a hook, and the vertical pole lies along the Lamed and Aleph Lamed ligature, standing for El here. So the scales rest actually on the Lamed, on the abbreviation of the Lamed, thus suggesting that it is God who holds the balance. Now, the four creatures that flank the scale are, of course, and we have seen them today already, allude or refer to the Ezekiel vision again, and are, of course, borrowed from Christian art and characterize the scenery as taking place at the throne of glory. The initial word in the Leipzig Machzor replaces, so to speak, if we look at this composition, here Ezekiel, and here an anthropomorphic image of God and the Christian example. This is somewhat later than the Leipzig Machzor. I just chose it because it is so strikingly similar. But there are numerous such, and we have seen some of them earlier. This motif is so frequent that this is just particularly similar. But there are many others, and certainly some earlier ones. So the initial word in the Leipzig Machzor here replaces, so to speak, the Christian anthropomorphic figure of God. The fact that the balance scales hang from the letters makes it clear that the word not only replaces the Christian image of God, but that it is actively integrated into the overall meaning of the imagery. The word is a definitive part of the iconography and an active agent in the communication of the visual message being conveyed. Furthermore, the ligature merges the two letters into one single entity, one sign. These two examples demonstrate that in Jewish iconography, words such as God or the Lord not only replace the anthropomorphic representation of God, often found in Christian iconography, but unthinkable of in Jewish contexts, but can be conceptually integrated into the overall imagery. The Lord who dwells in the temple, and God who holds the balance scale of the last judgment. The images that seem to take issue with anthropomorphism so dominant in Christian art. The Bible and the rabbinic tradition refer to God repeatedly in anthropomorphic terms. Not only did God create man in his own image according to Genesis chapter 1, but the Bible and the Talmudic literature are replete with details such as the hand of God, God putting out phylacteries, and so on. The bridegroom of the Song of Songs was often understood to be an allegorical representation of God offering his love to his people, and the description of the bridegroom is intensely anthropomorphic. In fact, the most usual method of dealing with biblical anthropomorphism was to interpret it as an allegory of theophany rather than as a revelation of an anthropomorphic God. However, things were not always so clear-cut. In the 12th century, the Sephardi philosopher Moses Maimonides noted, quote, "Our sages were far from the belief in the corporeality of God," unquote, referring to Chazal, of course. If anthropomorphism is indeed a taboo, why would Maimonides have to underscore that the Talmudic rabbis were far from the belief in the corporeality of God? His words must have been directed toward people who cast some doubt on this assumption. Maimonides was indeed concerned with the possibility that some Jews held less radical views on anthropomorphism than his own. Furthermore, we now know that in his assumption about the Talmudic rabbis, Maimonides was somewhat misled, and Yair Loberboim has recently shown that late antique and medieval Jewish approaches to anthropomorphism varied greatly. Not only are the Bible and rabbinic literature full of anthropomorphic references to God, but so is also late antique mystical literature. Time and again, late antique mystical texts about the heavenly shrines refer to God anthropomorphically or discuss the enormous size of God and his limbs. Moreover, Loberbaum has recently also suggested that clear anthropomorphic views can also be observed in mainstream rabbinic thought, the Tanaim, and he has actually a whole book about these references. It was indeed only in the Middle Ages that verbal anthropomorphism became subject to criticism, and Maimonides went so far as to condemn even an imagined picture of God. Anthropomorphism, he argued, sets the imagination working, and an imagined picture of God turns every prayer into an act of idolatry. The difficulties medieval philosophers had with the essence of God and the resulting question of how to refer to prophetic revelation led to a variety of approaches. Maimonides' position can be defined as radically anti-anthropomorphic. God is abstract, cannot be approached in terms of human features, and divine revelation was the result of the prophet's imagination. However, medieval references to a controversy that broke out after Maimonides, over Maimonides' teachings, already in the 1230s, indicate that there was also opposition to Maimonides' radical anthropomorphism, particularly among scholars in northern France. And this was part, of course, of the famous Maimonidean controversy that focused on messianism and other issues. But it turns out that anthropomorphism actually was part of this whole discourse. In any event, both anthropomorphism and the opposition to it suggest a specifically strict approach to the matter of visual representation of the divine in the form of a human figure. The notion of an anthropomorphic God does not necessarily imply the creation of an anthropomorphic image as a physical object, as it was obviously very common in the Christian environment. However, the fear that anthropomorphic description might actually be apt to encourage visual representation and lead to the transgression of idolatry means that the prohibition of visual representation of the divine has to be taken very seriously. Among others, anthropomorphism was a principal concern also of Ashkenazi pietists, and that is actually the very context that these manuscripts more or less had been produced, active in the Rhineland during the late 12th and the early 13th century. The pietists wrote several treatises that targeted questions of anthropomorphism and divine revelation. A central point for anyone dealing with these issues concerns the form of the divine revelations experienced by the biblical prophets. The pietists developed a comprehensive scholarly tradition, most of it esoteric, designed to resolve the apparent contradiction between the hidden Godhead and divine revelation. Rabbinic sources of late antiquity occasionally refer to divine revelation in terms of kavod, as it's very well known. So this is not, of course, a notion that the pietists invented, but they had their own very typical interpretation of it. In a treatise entitled Beliefs and Opinion, already Saadia Gaon discussed that notion in great detail. Unlike the abstract Godhead, the Creator, the revealed kavod, is approached, imagined, and visualized in anthropomorphic terms. And in this sense, God is revealed as a reflection of the upper kavod, as a visual equivalent without any physicality, and it is this reflection that man turns to in prayer. On the other hand, it is concentration prayer, and specifically concentration while uttering the letters of the full name of God, together with proper intention and the resulting contemplation that leads to the visualization of an anthropomorphic image that is then somehow merging with the notion, with the earlier rabbinic notion of the Shekhinah, which, by the way, in pietist thought becomes a feminine notion. The human imagination, where the image is formed, is compared to a mirror in which the Shekhinah appears as a reflection of the abstract Godhead, and in the absence of the temple, this visualization can take place only within the sacred space of the synagogue, the very space where the machzor is laid open and used and read from. Now, I'm not arguing that the letters here, El or Adon, designating the Lord or God, are visual expressions of a pietist mindset. These prayer books are not pietistic documents. But the pietist concerns with anthropomorphism must have had an impact on the way Jewish illuminators approached the representation of the divine, even several decades after pietist influence had waned, and how much it had waned we don't really know. There's a whole big discussion about the pietist's place in society, but anyway, we talk here, at least in relation to the Leipzig Machzor, about several decades after, say, Elazar of Worms had died. In fact, in case of the Leipzig Machzor, as I've shown in my book, the link to pietism might even be stronger. Elazar ben Yehuda had lived in Worms at the turn of the 13th century, the city where the Leipzig Machzor was later produced. As I've argued, the imagery in that Machzor was a powerful vehicle in community identity, and those who shaped that identity in the early 14th century looked back at Elazar as one of the key figures of their cultural history. Elazar was not just a strange, ascetic, sectarian pietist scholar, he also functioned as a communal authority, and we find his signature on rabbinical decisions of the Rhineland Rabbinic Council, and I'm grateful to Rainer for providing me the details. Again, I've elaborated on this, so I'll take it here very short. What I'm trying to say here is that that pietist thought had an impact, but not in terms of turning such a machzor into some vehicle of mystical experience, but actually that it is the communal aspects of that whole culture that were at the basis, so to speak, of the imagery of the Machzor. How then should we interpret these initial words in the panels of the Laut and the Leipzig Machzorim against this background of concerns with anthropomorphism? Do these initial words, as they are integrated in the imagery, refer to the hidden Godhead as an abstract sign, or do they circumscribe the revealed kavod, which, even though it could be imagined anthropomorphically, was not supposed to be represented pictorially in any form? I'm not sure, in fact, that we can make that distinction after all. Whatever the case, we are dealing here with the artistic solution of a complex issue, a solution that did not come from the pietists or from philosophers or from any rabbinic leadership, but rather from the artists themselves, who were very much aware of the concerns regarding anthropomorphism, but on the other hand were also aware of Christian art. They certainly had some sort of visual dialogue, and we have seen this here in the morning, and there's a lot of discourse going on about this. But it was not only the concern with anthropomorphism as such that led to the artistic solution of integrating letters into the imagery. The pietists approached the revealed kavod in terms of the visual, a phenomenon that is described and discussed in great detail by Elliot Wolfson. Wolfson argues that the theosophic understanding, and I'm quoting him, the theosophic understanding of the divine in the German pietists involves an ecstatic visionary component. In other words, knowing of the divine powers entails some vision of them. Letters, as we all know, have numerical value, which the pietists employed as a powerful exegetical tool. Approached via gematria, words in their letters receive a heavy exegetical burden, and this applies in a particularly high degree to words for the different names of God, words that circumscribe the unspeakable tetragrammaton. For example, Elazar of Worms authored a work entitled Sefer Hashem, which lists and interprets numerous designations for God that can serve as substitutes for the tetragrammaton. There's a long list of such designations, such as the name, Lord, Elohim, and many, many more. I'm not going to list them all here. At the beginning of this text, Elazar also describes a secret ceremony of the transmission of the divine name, a ritual in which a master teacher reveals the secrets of the divine name to his pupil. The text explains that both the teacher and the pupil are immersed in water and there recite a list of biblical verses that create a link between God and water. The name of God served as a vehicle for a mystical experience. Samuel of Speyer, who was active in the 12th century and was the earliest of the Ashkenazi pietists, is reported to have ascended to heaven by means of uttering the name of God. In another account, he filled a schoolhouse with light with the help of the name of God. All these practices are aimed at the visualization of the divine chariot or the heavenly throne. There, the weighing of the vices and virtues shown in the Leipzig image takes place. This is actually the base of the throne. Visualizing the light of the glory, divine revelation, can mean that the glory takes on an anthropomorphic shape. Similarly, a visualization of the letters of the name of God can also be part of a mystic experience. In conclusion, on the grounds of the second commandment, the anthropomorphic representation of the divine is a clear taboo in Jewish art, and that is certainly no news. The designers of 13th and 14th century Ashkenazi prayer books found a suitable solution by integrating words such as Lord, God, King into the imagery of initial panels. This was possible because a great number of piyutim begin with a word that designates God in one way or the other. And just you have to go through Davidson's Thesaurus to see how many, I mean, there's one volume only with Aleph, but more or less, and it mostly refers to some names of God. Hence, this particular type of initial word encourages, so to speak, iconographic use of Hebrew letters, which would not serve for books of the Bible, for example, with initial words such as Bereshit or Shmot or anything the like. So when you have Bereshit, it doesn't necessarily become an integral part of the iconography. So the argument I'm trying to make here is that actually in these cases and in others as well, the letters become in fact an integral part of the imagery. And what is probably more important to stress here is that it is actually the artists who come up with this and not and without this basing in some way on some sort of textual interpretation or exegesis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Dr. Ilia Rodov, is the head of the Department of Jewish Art at Bar-Ilan University and the editor of Ars Judaica Journal, a leading periodical in the field. He is the author of The Torah Arc in Renaissance Poland, a Jewish revival of classical antiquity, published by Brill in 2013, and many articles on European synagogue art, focusing on the history, patronage, paintings, sculptures, architectural decoration, and furniture design. Today we'll speak about the motif of the bear, intercultural context of East European synagogue art.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your kind presentation, and I thank all of you for staying here after a long day full of fascinating presentations. I would like to ponder the intercultural context of Jewish culture in Eastern Europe through a particular case study, images of bears in traditional Jewish art. An example of this imagery was found in the Synagogue of Rodov. The ceiling painting which I show here is a reconstruction from the Diaspora Museum. It contains 3 different images of bears. A bear cub licks honey from a pot, a few young bears climb a tree, this one, here, and one more, greater bear embracing a bush. One hardly may associate these peacefully or even amicably looking animals with the bears described in the Bible as malevolent predators. Wild bears were not so frequent in Eastern European towns as many Westerners believe, so that townsfolk were rather familiar with the tame bears appearing in basking performances. In the synagogue in Macheyev in Ukraine, a chained bear was sculpted next to a serenely sitting cow to illustrate Isaiah's prophecy of the peaceful coexisting of these creatures in the Messianic times. In synagogues, there is the only known to us instance of the bear images that could be inspired by the artist's memoirs of trained bears. However, it doesn't make much sense to see a sort of genre scene in the painting of, for example, this sweet-toothed bear cub in Khodorov. Instead, it seems to be more promising to read this image in the context of Jewish customs. Since the medieval times, licking honey or tasting sweets have been a part of the initiation ritual of children beginning their Torah studies in Jewish communities, and we have a lot of literature on this subject. Several early Ashkenazi sources tell that the teacher puts honey on the tablet with Hebrew letters and pupils lick them. Then the teacher declaims a verse from Ezekiel that describes the learning of text as its devouring, and states that the book of divine revelation is as sweet as honey. Thus, in Jewish minds, the bear's enjoyment of honey may allegorize the student's delight of wisdom. The images associating the bear enjoying honey and the Bible studies were neither an 18th century invention nor exclusively Jewish device. I proposed elsewhere that such a symbol appeared first in a Hebrew incunabulum in Portugal. In 16th century Switzerland, a bear reaching a beehive and an open book displaying the Hebrew tetragrammaton were depicted on the title page of the Protestant translation of the Bible into Spanish. In German and Slavic folk tales, the bears appear as powerful masters of the forest, anthropomorphic creatures, or shape-shifted men. Unlike Jewish art, the Eastern European folklore usually describes the bears as prevailingly simple-minded or silly beings whose stomach often leads them to troubles. This folklore largely followed the unfavorable stance of Christian theology towards the bear's appetite, which was interpreted as a vice of gluttony and greed. For example, in the 12th century, Hildegard of Bingen postulated that the eating of sweet fruit similarly incited lust in the bears and in Adam, who for this reason was expelled from paradise. The medieval Christian iconography depicted allegoric bears climbing a tree that is seeking for honey or sweet fruit rather than eating them. The accent on the effort at omitting the sin of enjoy emphasizes the bear's sinful passion. The example of a lustful bear on the gate frame in the cathedral of Tarnów in Poland could have been seen by the local Jews whose synagogue was found in a couple of minutes by walk. Yet the formal affinity of the Christian and Jewish iconography of climbing bears may mislead. More instrumental for our discussion can be the iconography of climbing human figures in West European emblem books. For example, in the French emblem book published in Latin and several more languages, a drawing of a putti looking at the tree's root and his fellow climbing the trunk symbolizes a stupid student who sees not but the ground, and a clever one who ascends to wisdom and deserves his reward by picking the fruit. Another emblemata published in Germany shows the same process of studies twice. Once as a portrayal of a teacher with his pupil, and once more as an allegory of a child climbing a palm tree. This Neoplatonic allegory of the process of education as the student's ascension on high by climbing a tree may be traced back to the illustration of study books in late 15th century Venice. On the title page of Guarini's book of Latin grammar, The bottom piece gives a realistic view of classes, while the margin image of climbing putti shows the symbolic aspect of studies. The only winged child with an apple or angel sitting at the tree top evokes associations with the literary motive that is known to us from the 12th century legend of Percival and its numerous later versions. The legend tells that the protagonist meets a mystical child with an apple who climbs a tree on his way to the paradise, or in several versions to Christ. In Renaissance Italy, the allegory of children climbing the tree and reaching its top could represent the humanistic studies as an intellectual ascension and its spiritual reward. The didactic meaning of the image of climbing putti was probably apparent to the renowned Italian Jewish printer Gershom Soncino, who printed a remake of the illustration on the title page of the Orach Chaim chapter in his edition of Jacob ben Asher's Arba Turim, the standard medieval Jewish manual of religious life. In his edition, Soncino also added a depiction of a rabbi and his pupils, and thereby repeated the Venetian idea of a double representation of the educational process, once realistically and once more allegorically. The Jewish printer and the readers of his book could understand the image of climbing people as an allegory of spiritual ascension in the light of the biblical story of Jacob's ladder and the midrashim that tells about Jewish souls reaching the heaven by climbing the tree of life. The climbing bears in Rodov seems thus to be an inventive blend of two models that were adapted to Jewish symbolism and to their display in a synagogue. The Jewish interpretation both strips the climbing bear of its Christian negative connotations and avoids the human images. One may even note a resemblance of the bear looking down and another reaching the tree top to the two contesting students in the Pictopoesis illustration. Once adopted in synagogue art, the image of climbing bears reiterated there in numerous versions. In the synagogue in Mogilov on the Dnieper, the painter Chaim Segal clearly defined the bear's target: beehives or barrels of honey on the tree branches. Here. The menorah-like Hanukkah from Lviv is designed as a tree, and a bear climbs it to reach a honeypot replete with bees. This one. Going back to the Rodov synagogue, the bears appear to be an allegory of the Torah studies, a principal virtue of every pious Jew. This lifelong commitment likely shown in its stages from the initial learning of the language through climbing the tree of knowledge to its heavenly source. Suiting well the proposed interpretation, the uppermost, greatest bear embracing branches of a plant may thus symbolize a stage of reaching wisdom. Thus it seems to be a semantic counterpart to the angel celebrating his ascension in the Italian allegory. The assumption is reinforced by the metaphor of divine wisdom in Proverbs 3:18 as the tree of life for those who hold on it. This verse is often quoted in rabbinical literature and recited in the course of synagogue service. As we saw, the wise birds in East European Jewish art have a little in common with the spiteful bears in the Bible and the silly bears in European folklore. Curiously enough, the accent on the bear's passion for honey as an allegory of a Jew longing for the Torah echoes the definitions of beer in Slavic languages. Niedźwiedź in Polish, as well as vedmid, medved, medved, and the like in Ukrainian, Russian, Czech, and more. All these names are composed of the noun med, meaning honey, and the verbal root ved, meaning both consuming and witting, having knowledge, possessing knowledge. Whereas the people in Eastern Europe were scarcely aware of the etymology of the Semitic root dalet bet, dov, and other versions in Semitic languages, and of the name bear or bern and so on in German languages, the meaning of the definition of bear as honey eater was clear for everyone speaking any Slavic language. Whatever the cultural triggers could be, it is noticeable that in the Ashkenazi diaspora, the bear implied positive allegoric connotations. A spectacular manifestation of this semantics is the Jewish adoption of the personal male name bear, often coupled with the Hebrew dov. A carved copy of the sprawling bear from the synagogue painting designates the name of Dov Ber Birkenthal of Bolichov on his tombstone. Over and above the plain association of the men's and animals' names, the bear holding a crown, it was a crown here, instead of a shrub, most likely praises the scholarship of this Hebrew writer and memorist. The sprawling pose of the bear in Rodov duplicates a bear image decorating several Hebrew books that circulated in early 18th century Ashkenazi communities. The original woodcut play depicting a bear hunt was produced for a Dutch press in Amsterdam, then sold there to Jewish printer Attias, and later changed several more hands. Close semblance of the bear in the ceiling painting to the book illustration suggests that it was the painter of the synagogue in Rodov who first adopted this image and involved it into the symbolic program of synagogue decoration. The image of the bear in a bush was often replicated and usually simplified in many synagogues on ritual objects and tombstones. This one is found in the synagogue of Landshut, and this one from the lost Gvozdet synagogue reappears in the reconstruction of its painted ceiling in the new Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. The last image in this series I would like to show you today of bears embracing a bush dominates the tombstone of a certain Rivka Bat Judah Leib of Satanov, whose name is in no way hints at bears. As we saw, the bear's embrace of a bush was first designed to express the bear's Fear of Hunters in books from Amsterdam, and later in East European synagogues, this gesture was read as the birth hold of the tree of life. On the stone of a Jewish woman in Ukraine, one could have understood the same gesture as a maybe motherly hug of their offsprings, a paraphrase of the Christian visual allegory of caritas. This example epitomizes the unstable nature of symbols, whose meaning could alter or vanish even when they were used within the same culture. In conclusion, the geography of sources and ways of the transmission of images and ideas discussed above creates a virtual map of visual culture that crosses political and religious borders and stretches out of the Eastern European region. It seems that the artists who introduced innovations into synagogue art first targeted at a certain symbolic program and then consciously constructed it using the available stock of appropriate models of whatever origin. The implantation of alien elements into the native culture was followed by a process of reiterating and dissolving of the implants. The still popular theory of cultural influences, implying a viral or electromagnetic model of cultural exchange, describes the cultures as infecting or irradiating each other. I would prefer the biological metaphor of a hybrid, describing each culture as an ever-changing conglomerate of its traditional and adopted components. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker is Michal Sternthal, the head of the manuscript section at the Center for Jewish Art of the Hebrew University. She has been the leader of several documentation and research teams at different libraries in Europe. She is the co-author of the Catalogue of Abraham Scenes in the Bezalel Narkis Index of Jewish Art, published by the Index of Christian Art in Princeton. Elijah and David Nezer Zahav, the physician, scribes and illuminators in Apulia, and the Catalogue of Hebrew illuminated manuscripts at the National Library in Vienna, which is still in press. Our title today is I Spread Out My Hands unto the Lord my God. And I have to add something else. Michal doesn't feel very well, and she has made great efforts to join us, so I'm very grateful to you. In the name of everybody. Thank you.
In the present lecture, we will focus on the hand gestures of praying figures depicted in Jewish art, focusing mainly on depictions found in medieval Ashkenazi illuminated manuscript. As we shall see, the shift from the spread out hands in prayer to other hand gestures has several meanings. The sages understood that body gestures play an important role during prayer, as it is these gestures which have the ability to constantly remind the believer that he is, in fact, engaged in a close and personal encounter with God himself. As brought down in Psalms, I have set the Lord always before me. Shiviti Hashem lenegdi tamid. The sages instructed specific guidelines which must be followed by the person praying in order to prepare himself for his meeting with the Lord. As it is said in the book of Amos, prepare to meet the God, O Israel. Hikon likrat Elohecha Israel. The great significance of body language, a completely non-verbal medium for conveying a message, lies... תודה. בסדר?
איך זה?
זה כזה בפרצוף שלי כזה? יופי, יופי. סליחה. Lies in the fact that a person's physical behavior is not only influenced by his consciousness, but most important, it also has the power to affect his consciousness. As such, the rules of behavior during prayer are meant to influence the awareness of the person engaged in prayer and to properly guide him into an appropriate atmosphere. In relation to head gesture to be employed during prayer, it seems that there does not exist a single obligatory hand gesture, but rather a variety of optionals hand gesture described in medieval halachic literature. These are learned from the single reference found in the entire Talmud to hand gesture in prayer. However, these gestures all share a common goal. The purpose is to lead the believer into the atmosphere of one who is standing as a slave before a king. In Tractate Shabbat, Rav and Rav Kahana are described praying while throwing back their mantle and holding hands together. I think I'm going to skip we're not going to read it. But the commentators, you see he used the term, he used the term ufachar yadei. Ufachar yadei, this is an enigmatic word, which wasn't clear, that he prayed, Rav and Rav Kahana were prayed while they hold their hands in this gesture. The commentator interprets the enigmatic term to explain the fashion in which Rabba and Rav Kahana would hold their hands. Rashi expounds, with fingers interlocked. חובק ידיו באצבעותיו מבציר בלעז. While Rabbeinu Hananel and Harif, both from the 11th century, interprets it with covered hands. Maimonides explained that the meaning is to hold both hands on the heart, the right hand over the left, like a slave in front of his master. Maimonides' halachic source is highly significant, as Maimonides described in great detail the appropriate gesture to be made during prayer, and the role in the Shulchan Aruch in the 16th century is following his halacha. The preparation of one's body. When one stands in prayer, he should place his feet together side by side. He should set his eyes downwards, etc., and lift his heart upwards as if he's standing in heavens. His hands should be resting on his heart with the right hand clasped over the left hand. He should stand like a servant before his master in fear, awe, and dread. He should not rest his hands on his hips. I don't know, actually, when I prepared it, I asked a lot of people who are religious if they keep this gesture, and I was told that no, they don't keep it, although it appears in Shulchan Aruch, and it's supposed to be the way you should pray, and a lot of people didn't know about it, and a few did, but although it appears, people felt free to pick other gestures. Unfortunately, I could not find any illustration in Jewish art that present a praying figure holding its hands according to Maimonides' instructions, hands on the heart, right hand covering the left. I don't know if anyone did, but I didn't find any depiction. However, other optional hand gestures are recorded, for instance, in Sefer Orchot Chaim of Aaron ben Yaakov HaKohen of Lunil, from Provence, end of the 13th century, first half of the 14th century. Don't worry, I'm going to show illuminated manuscript soon. He quotes Maimonides' role and then continues on the state that everything is according to the local custom. In some places where people speak to their king while embracing their hands in such a way that the right hand holds their left elbow and the left hand holds their right elbow, one should pray in this manner. However, there are places where they hold their hands with the fingers embraced, and there are places where they hold their hands together behind their back, and they all stand like one without hands in weakness before the Lord. Thus we learn from this source that each person should gesture with his hands according to the accepted custom of his country, of how a royal subject would stand before this king. Let us note again that Rabbi Aaron, Maimonides, and earlier in the Talmud all employ the metaphor of a servant standing before his king or master in describing a person standing in prayer before God. An illustration of a praying figure holding his hands behind his back as if he is without hands appears in this Ashkenazi Machzor in the lower margin of the Piyut Akdamot Milin recited on the festival of Shavuot. Another method of holding the hands presented in Ashkenazi manuscript in placing them under the talit or the garment. Here is the first Kaufman Machzor, a late 13th century Ashkenazi Machzor. We see Chazan slightly bent at the waist with his head leaning downwards while reciting the Kol Nidrei prayer at the beginning of the Yom Kippur evening prayers. The Chazan is wrapped in his talit and his hands are not visible and seen to be hidden behind his talit. These covered hands could either be interpreted as another version of the custom to pray with one's hands placed behind the back, or as depicting the custom following Rabbeinu Hananel and Arif, who interprets the Talmudic passage of Bachar Yadav, as we saw, with covered hands. Another option is that they hold their hands on their heart. It's not this one, as Maimonides requires, but this is only a bold speculation with no evidence to support it. Beside the two hand gesture we have already defined of covered hands or hands held behind the back, a third gesture exists. This is the gesture of praying with hand claps together, the so-called Christian praying gesture par excellence. This type of hand gesture appears in many Jewish illuminated manuscripts from Ashkenaz. Thus, for example, in the London Miscellany, produced in the late 13th century in northern France, Moses is depicted sitting on a large stone while Aaron and Hur supported his clasped hands in order that the Israelites succeed in their battle against the Amalekites. Moses' hands are supposed to be upraised, but as we see here, it's held in clasped hands and low, which shows how the convention of this way of holding the hands, this gesture, so how much it was strong to represent Moses in prayer. It doesn't appear in the Bible that he was praying. He only held his hands up. But actually the first was in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer that says that his hands was in a praying gesture. So it was very important for the artist to show the praying, even though it wasn't exactly the way it was described in the Bible. So too in the Moscovich Machzor, produced in the 1340s in the Upper Rhine at the opening of the Yotzer for the Day of Atonement. In this illustration, we see two kneeling angels. We have to use our imagination. I couldn't find a better slide. Raising their hands in prayer. This type of hand gesture, in which the hands are clasped together, appears also in manuscript from, we'll run from Italy, Spain, or Crete. But lack of time, I won't get into it. Some of the manuscripts we have seen were illustrated by non-Jewish artists, such as the London Miscellany or the Moscovich Machzor. This fact, perhaps, could explain this type of depictions by ascribing them to the Christian artist who depicted the praying figures in the manner in which he was familiar with. However, this type of hand gesture is also found in manuscripts that research proved were most probably illuminated by Jewish artists, such as the second Nuremberg Haggadah that Professor Kogman-Appel proved that it was a Jewish artist who illuminated it. As we see here, Yitzchak and Rivka in the clasped hands, and we see also a midrashic element that Yitzchak, next to his wife, entreated in prayer, granted his prayer and not hers. Granted his prayer and not hers. Or in the Meravilya Sidur. As we know, it was done by Yoel Ben Shimon. One could perhaps still challenge this evidence and claim that this pictorial hand gesture is one of the many iconographical motifs that were adapted to Jewish purposes from Christian models, although it was never practiced by Jews. However, research has found that there do indeed exist several literary sources which mention the clasped hands gesture on a Jewish praying custom and may support the assumption that Jews indeed use this gesture while praying. In Sefer Minhag Tov, composed by an anonymous author in Italy in the second half of the 13th century, we read, "It is a good custom to join both hands till they will seem like one while praying." In the 15th century, Israel ben Ptachia Isserlen, who spent time in Germany, Austria, and Italy, noted the gesture described by Maimonides, but also continues on to describe it as one in which the hands are clasped together closely until it seemed like one. Therefore, we can assume that Jews really practice in this way, holding the hands in the so-called Christian prayer gestures par excellence. When and how did the gesture of praying with clasped hands penetrated Jewish art and realm? In Christian art, these gestures appear in Western Europe as early as the 9th century, but only in the 12th, 13th century did it become the Christian prayer gesture par excellence. Not long before our finds in Jewish manuscripts. It is commonly accepted by researchers that this gesture of clasped hands is rooted in the secular sphere. It seems to have derived from the Frankish feudal custom for a vassal to present himself to his lord with clasped hands, and in that context, it signifies subjection and submission. Perhaps it was the Franciscan movement who brought this gesture to liturgy, or perhaps it was other sources. In any case, this gesture became the predominant way of praying in Christian liturgy. In his treatise, Be'er Sheva, Rabbi Sachar Bar-Ilan, an Italian-Polish rabbi who lived in the second half of the 16th century to the beginning of the 17th century, wonders as to the fate of the biblical tradition of spreading one's arms out in prayer. He notes that Moses, Ezra, and others are described in the Bible as spreading their arms out to the heavens or towards the temple in prayer, and wonders why this custom is not still practiced in his time. His answer is that now the Gentiles pray in this manner by holding their arms upwards. Which hand gesture is Rabbi Ilenburg referring to in this passage? Is it the Christian hand gesture of clasped hands with the fingers pointing upwards, or perhaps he's referring to the practice of spreading the arms out of prayer which was prevalent in Christian liturgy in the early centuries, but which by the 13th century had been replaced by the clasped hands. The ancient gesture of hands spread out or lifted up to Lord is mentioned already in the Bible, as well as in other Jewish sources, dating up until the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. For example, while celebrating the construction of the temple, King Solomon says, "And spread forth his hands forward this house." And also Ezra, "I fell upon my knees and spread out my hands unto the Lord." Following the destruction of the Second Temple, we find no Jewish literary sources mentioning this gesture. From this, we may assume that praying with spread out hands was the main gesture of praying among Jews up until the times that the Christian adopted this gesture as a sign of the cross, at which point the Jews abandoned this gesture for others. Supporting this assumption is the testimony of the North African church father Tertullian. In his composition on prayer, he notes that Jews do not bear to raise their hands or expand them because of the crime of killing the Lord himself. We, the Christians, however, not only raise but even expand them, and taking our model from the Lord Passion, even in prayer we confess to Christ. Targum Yonatan and Targum Onkelos, both written in Israel in the 1st or 2nd centuries, translates the words in Exodus regarding Moses, "and spread abroad his hands unto the Lord." Spread abroad his hands in prayer. They added both the words in prayer. According to Uri Ehrlich, the addition in prayer indicates that this gesture was not associated with prayer anymore at the time when these later translations of Yonatan and Onkelos were written. Indeed, in art produced between 2nd and 6th centuries in North Africa, the Middle East, and Italy, we find hundreds of praying figures depicted with arms spread out and hands lifted up in the so-called orange gesture, the gesture of the praying gesture. Among the figures depicted are those of Old Testament figures praying for salvation, such as Noach, Daniel, and the three Hebrews in the reference, as we see on the screen. The adaptation of the orange gesture to the depiction of the crucifixion goes back to the early 1st centuries to the depiction of Moses raising his hands in the battle with the Amalekites. For the early Christian, this episode, describing Moses' victory over the Amalekites by raising his hands, was an important archetype for salvation through the cross. According to the belief, it was by assuming the posture of Christ on the cross that Moses overcame Amalek. The author of the Epistle of Barnabas and the early apologists Justin, Tertullian, Origen, and others all interpreted this story as a foreshadowing of the cross. It was one of the main examples of their reading of the Old Testament as a prefiguration of the New Testament. We see here the oldest representation of Moses at the battle with the Amalekites, depicted in a mosaic floor of the 5th century of the nave of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. Here Moses stands on the hilltop above the fighting armies with his arm outstretched in the orange posture. Beside him are Aaron and Hur. To conclude the discussion of this hand gesture, Tertullian testimony, together with the fact that there appear to be almost no Jewish literary sources which mention the spread out hand gesture in prayer in the period after the Second Temple, has led scholars to the conclusion that it was at this point in time the Jews stopped praying in this posture. Ehrlich explains that it was possible for the Jews to abandon this ancient gesture also because of the high importance that the sages of the period ascribed to the notion that the thought behind the act is more important than the pursuit itself, and especially in relation to prayer. This idea reduced the importance of the act itself and was most probably helpful in abandoning the ancient gesture. However, the orange gesture continued to be depicted in Jewish art, as it is evident, for example, in the Synagogue of Dura Europos. Oh my! they are not here.
It was before.
Hmm?
It was before.
Yeah? Ah, no. No. I missed this. לא נורא? דווקא it's important. I have 3 examples in Jewish art that shows the orant gestures that still exist in art. Okay. We have seen that the gesture of orants continued to appear in visual depiction of biblical scene in the ancient synagogue in Dura and in Israel until the 6th century. I mean in Ma'on and in Ashot. 3 or so centuries after the gesture, as was supposedly abandoned according to the scholars and according to the literary sources. זה 20 minutes. As such, this raised the question of whether the visual convention was so strong that in spite of the Jewish sensitivity to the orant's posture, as a Christian motive, it continued to be depicted uninterrupted, at least in the land of Israel and in Dura. I doubt that they lost their sensitivity. If it was so much mezuhe, we identify with the Christian meaning, it is very hard to understand how come they continue to depict it in synagogues. So I want to suggest something, another explanation, that the Jews abandoned the spread-out gesture because it was not a suitable gesture anymore to express the relationship between them and God. It would seem that the transition from the biblical period in which there existed personal, unmediated interaction with God to the period of the sages, together with the loss of the temple, gradually brought forth the sense of an ever-growing distance between man and God. In the Bible, we find awe and fear of God, but also direct dialogue existing between man and God in an unmediated personal manner. It was only natural that Moses, Solomon, Ezra, and others turned to God with a confident and the natural gesture of outstretched arm. I don't know, it's something very natural that you open your hands when you feel confident with the relation with God. In contrast, with the destruction of the temple and the growing distance between the king and the servant, the gesture of hands naturally depicted a more closed, introspective tendency, like we saw the gesture. The relationship between the believing Jew and God was defined by the sages as parallel to what of a servant standing before his master, the king, defeated, helpless, in fear and in awe. Thus, it is understandable that this would be conveyed through practice, and so in visual art as well, in the gesture of people depicted in prayer. I was very brave to suggest it. Thank you.
Please come to the stage. Katrin. Thank you very much for the 3 lectures, and now we will open the stage for questions, please. Yes, please.
My question is for Ilia. I wondered, where did the Polish Niedźwiedź disappear during your lecture? Meaning, why do you ignore completely the image of the bear in Polish sources, very widespread in Polish sources, and moreover in Pravoslav, in Greek Orthodox churches, prayer books, and so on? All the examples that you brought were from the eastern parts of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where the majority of, one would think that the immediate influence would be Greek Orthodox.
Thank you for your question. I really don't know many depictions of bears in Christian Orthodox churches. as far as I remember, maybe one or two depictions from prayer books, or even not prayer books, from illuminated manuscripts, one from Romania, one maybe from Bulgaria, and I'm not sure about the sources and the relation to my material. Yes, really, bears are very popular in East European folklore and Slavic folklore, and they appear as folklore creatures in folk art, but then they are, as I try to explain, master of the forest, or a little bit silly or simple-minded person or anthropomorphic creature. So I think this has no direct relation to the materials that I try to explain. At the same time, the semantics of the name of bear in Slavic languages is much closer. So I think the sources were not local. In this case, it's just a kind of combination of local ideas and the models that came from far away. So this is what I think.
First, thank you very much all for fascinating lectures. I have two questions. One is for, thank you. One is for Katrin. I'm fascinated by what you showed us, and I was wondering, first, to what extent can we talk about the concept that you were trying to convey as a Jewish mirror image of the Verbum Incarnatum? Actually, that is exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing a sort of a Jewish response to a theological concept that is very prevalent in the surrounding society, that Christ is the Word come into the flesh, and here it's the distorted mirror image. We're doing exactly the opposite. We're using a verb or word in order to symbolize God, but without depicting Him in the flesh, in no form or fashion. The other thing I was wondering about is something that struck me when you were discussing Shmuel Chassid. On the one hand, Shmuel Chassid is extremely well known, both in folklore and in literature, as someone who's a master of the divine name. On the other hand, when we look into the writings of the Hasidei Ashkenaz, it is very clear that Shmuel is driving very hard to prevent people from using the divine name in any way that would be seen as desecrating it, even making vows that are not intended. His battle against Shvu'ah and the thought of conceptualizing the name of God or using the name of God for a secular issue is in direct contrast to what you were trying to show, how elevating the name of God is and kind of symbolizing it is part of his agenda. So I think that kind of may support what you were saying. And the question to Ilia about the issue of the bears, is there any correspondence between any of the bear imagery in the Rodov ceiling, synagogue ceiling, with any of the writing on the Rodov synagogue ceiling? If I remember correctly, there's writing there regarding. I mean, there's stuff that relates to who the artist is and who his function is, and the rest has to do, if memory serves, and again, I'm not 100% sure, with speaking or not talking during prayer. There's a quote of Okeach, there's a quote of Elazar of Worms, saying that whoever speaks in the synagogue is an unfriendly neighbor to God. And does that, or I don't remember if that is the only wording, and if there is any relationship between anything that is going on there and the wording in the ceiling.
Thank you. I hadn't thought about the realm incarnatum. This is which I should have. It's very interesting, and yes, it could be. I mean, these cases of cultural mirroring actually what you are certainly very dominant in this culture in general, and yes, but again, I would probably not be too much. I mean, I see this really as an artistic solution, as a visual thing, and so I wouldn't carry too much into. I mean, I would carry it into Jewish theology, but it's still very interesting, and of course the parallel is beautiful. And yes, of course, I mean about and of course this about the profanation. I mean, yeah, it's mausoleum, it's prayer, it's piyut, and it's really it happens only in this very sphere of prayer at the during the holidays and so on. So yes, I mean, thanks. I have nothing more to say.
Thank you for your question. For the best of my knowledge, there is no connection between the inscriptions in the ceiling to this or most of the other images, except of the eagle in the very center. And here we really have a problem, maybe a problem for us, for the researchers, because most of the images until the maybe late 18th century in the synagogues were not labeled. This tradition started much later, during the 19th century. It doesn't always help us anyway, but you know, sometimes yes, here not. There are a few other different interpretations of this beer in Khodorov. I just try to show how I can interpret this. Another problem is I try to show that there is no direct link between, or constant link between the signifier and signified in any place and here in synagogue art. Sarah spoke about this too, about the changing nature of images in art. Thank you.
I want to continue this argument between you and, or not argument, this discussion between Effie and Katrin. I think that we have to yield for caution. There is, of course, this theory, this philosophy of the parties is there, but I'll be extremely happy to find a depiction of God as an old man, as God as a warrior, a God as a young warrior. I mean, we see all that as a verbal expression of what God, the imaginary God that appears in Hasidei Ashkenaz. But I'm sure it will never happen. I mean, no Jew will dare depicting God in the Machzor as a warrior, as a man, as excuse me, as an old man putting tefillin on his left hand. Even though it's depicted in the Talmud and again depicted by Hasidei Ashkenaz. Because that goes back to the neighbors. So even though they're extremely, Hasidei Ashkenaz are permitting themselves verbally to be very, very anthropomorphic. And Metatron, the similarity between Metatron and Jesus sometimes is, as Moshe Idel like to show, is all there. But yet, they'll never depict it as an illumination. So I think we have to be careful with the distance between the theory and the practice. The practice, halacha comes first.
That's my point. That's my point. Absolutely. That's my point. That's why the letters come in. So, yes. No. I mean, that is exactly the point. I mean, it's actually, I mean, they deal so much with anthropomorphism and not, I mean, and they use, but they make a clear distinction between the textual and the visual, and the whole point is actually that even with living in this neighborhood where they, you know, whenever you go through town, you see a tympanon, and it's all there. I mean, I haven't shown, but you know, it's so present, and it's beautiful, and it's very eloquent, and actually the solution comes as an insistence of exactly what you're saying, and there's certainly nothing to be expected. And I think that actually the use of the letters that are, as such, of so much importance in the pietist mindset is just an interesting visual solution. It's not the scholars who offer that solution, not at all. They never talk about this. You know, they don't talk about art at all. The pietists wouldn't have wanted to see an illuminated Machzor. I mean, I'm sure that Elazar of Worms would not have been thrilled with the whole project, but. It's there because it is so much part of the general ambience that it's out there. But so yes, I totally agree with you.
You can keep the background.
As far as putting the hand, one hand over the other when thinking, well, we have it quite a lot in Arabic medicine of the period. Which shoe do you put first, and which shoe put later? How do you start walking? Which leg will go first, and so on, another. Maimonides, I don't, he was of course an Arabic doctor, as you know, and he knew all this literature, and I wonder whether there is here no kind of, how shall I put it, reference or unconscious reference even to medical literature, Arabic literature. But I would like, if I have already the microphone, say something about onomastics. The onomastics of East European Jews, which I don't know very well, is basically, you say dove, bear, you say aryeh, leib. I don't know whether you say zev, wolf, but okay. This is not at all the case in the Middle Ages. There we commit horrible mistakes when we have a Latin name and we say, well, his Hebrew name must have been. I'll give you an example from your own onomastics. We have in England and elsewhere the name Ursellus. Now, Ursus in Latin, as you know, is bear. But Ursellus is not the Hebrew name of the Urselli that we have. It's generally Oshaya, out of the whole world. And by the same token, George, for which there is no Hebrew translation, will be Joseph. And there is a historian, beautiful historian, Italian historian, Vittore Colorni, who I don't know that he's alive, who wrote the whole article about the correspondence between Hebrew and non-Hebrew names. He, of course, talks about the Middle Ages and mostly in a Roman, Romance context, which he has two rules. First of all, it is not necessarily a translation. And rule number two, nevertheless, every Ursellus is Oshaya. Every Joseph is George, Georgius, if you would like, and the like. Now, when and how did East European stick to a translation, would be interesting to see how and why and when.
Okay, we should conclude our session, but there is someone who is waiting for a long time, so...
May I respond anyway?
Just a minute, I will give you
Okay.
afterwards. We'll take the questions.
Thanks, I'll make it quick. I wanted to direct to Michal Sternthal about your suggestion that that the switch from hand gesture directed upwards reflected a distance from...
And spread out. That's, I think, the most important. I mean, like the orange gesture. It's not only towards heaven, but also the expanding gesture.
Yes. So the abandoning of that, the abandonment of that reflected. So first of all, I wanted to mention an article by Yitzhak Eric Zimmer on body language. I believe that he comes to a similar type of conclusion as the one you offered, and I believe it kind of zooms in onto a point that Professor Kogman-Appel talked about at length, which was anthropomorphism. That really what we're getting, or rather than anthropomorphism, the eradication of anthropomorphism. That's really the nekuda, and that comes forth in the Rambam, who was the great eradicator of anthropomorphism, and who codifies in the halakha that one should not look up, one should look down. The looking up, the raising the hands up to the heavens, is the heavens is where God sits on his throne, according to the anthropomorphic view, and that view must be eradicated. And as a part of that eradication is directing the gaze, at least the physical gaze, where we don't want to physically postulate God sitting in the heavens, downwards. I believe that's the direction that Professor Zimmer takes there. And I also want to mention another article by my teacher, Shama Friedman, which is called Anthropomorphism and Its Eradication. And there he discusses the efforts of Maimonides and parallel efforts in the Christian world to eradicate anthropomorphism in the Middle Ages.
So a quick answer, please. Okay, we can conclude. Thank you. Oh, sorry, please.
Okay. I have a couple of bears untreated. So I didn't mean that these names were used in medieval Ashkenaz. What I talked about was about the early modern times. Really, I don't know such a name. Maybe the first examples of Tzvi Hirsch come from the late 15th century. And there, even later, maybe 17th century. So it was a very late development. And I just ponder the situation when the Jews adopt non-Jewish animal names, bear or wolf, zev, wolf. It's not Tanakhic any source, so it was local. And then they legitimized these alien names with Hebrew counterparts. And we know animal names in German languages. Bernard, for example, Bernhard, strong bear, and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. We'd like to thank the speakers and the audience. See you tomorrow.